Hello, I'm Namo Abdulla, and this time we're doing Inside America from Erbil, the capital of the Iraqi Kurdistan region. Politicians, activists, and journalists from across the globe use the term Arab Spring. It was referred to the uprisings launched by millions of average Arabs to topple their longtime autocratic leaders. Even superpowers like the United States were forced to withdraw their longtime support for dictators such as Hosni Mubarak of Egypt. But almost 2 years later, this is what we have. In Egypt, the most populous Arab nation, the first democratically elected president has been ousted, and the old Mubarak-era army is back in control. In Libya, different militia groups act independently and threaten the very unity of the oil-rich nation. In Syria, the United Nations says more than 100,000 people have died as a popular uprising has turned into a civil war. The Middle East conflicts have additionally produced a refugee crisis which threatens broader regional stability. Al-Qaeda, which seems to have found new safe havens in places such as Syria, shows resilience and has recently launched more deadly attacks in Iraq. So is the Arab Spring over? Or was the use of the term a misperception in the first place? Joining me to discuss the subject is Graham Bannerman, a former staffer for Middle East and South Asia on U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He also served as former Middle East analyst on U.S. State Department policy planning staff. He has taught about the Middle East at several universities, including George Washington and the American University of Beirut. My second guest is Manal Omar, who serves as Director of Iraq, Iran, and North Africa programs in the Center for Conflict and Management at the U.S. Institute for Peace. Omar has extensive experience in the Middle East. She worked with Women International and Regional Coordinator for Afghanistan, Iraq, and Sudan. She launched her career as a journalist in the Middle East in 1996. Graham, thank you so much for talking to us. Manal, as well, thank you so much for being present on this episode of Inside America. Graham, I'd like to start off with you. Can you tell us what's happening in Egypt now?
Well, Egypt is going through a very difficult transition period. Clearly, the events on Wednesday of all of the people being killed and through the clashes between the Egyptian police and the demonstrators was something that no one wanted to see happen, but unfortunately this has occurred. Now we're in the process of seeing where do the Egyptians go from here. Will they be able to continue the process forward and hopefully develop a political consensus, or have the rifts become so great that they'll never be able to cross those divides? We just don't know at this time.
And I would like to stay with you, Graham, for one more question. President Obama actually interrupted his vacation, and he said that we will not be able to maintain the same kind of relationship if we see civilians being killed on the streets in Egypt. What does that mean? Does that mean we're going to expect the relations between Egypt and the United States worsen anytime soon?
No, I think the administration is wrestling with a very difficult problem. They were clearly concerned as Americans over the events of Egypt, and no one wanted to see the tragic events of Wednesday with all of these people being killed and dying. It's very unfortunate. That said, what the American foreign policy makers can do is very limited. The American influence in Egypt is limited because the Egyptians are solving the problems themselves. All foreigners have limitations of what they can do, and the Americans included. The pressure, however, on the administration is from the American foreign policy establishment. If you sit in Washington, you hear all the time the people saying we must cut aid to Egypt, we must change the relationship. The problem for the administration is if they did that, that could change for the negative a relationship that's taken 35 years to build. Therefore, they're being very cautious to see how events play out before they make any irreparable decisions.
Manal, I would like to go to you now. You've been in the Middle East, you have been a journalist, you've covered the region. I would like to ask you whether the question that I asked in the setup piece of the program, do you think the Arab Spring is over, or was the use of the term a misperception in the first place?
I think that it's very important that we don't leap to any conclusions about the death of the Arab Spring or that the movement itself has taken a derailment. I just got back from Egypt. I spent most of Ramadan in Cairo, traveled around Alexandria and most of Upper Egypt, spent a lot of time talking to people, and Egyptians are very much saying the opposite. They're saying that this is the reincarnation of the Arab Spring. It's a protection of what happened 2 years ago, that the whole debate about if it's a correction, Egyptians are very much feeling that whatever happens next, there has never been an option of returning to pre-January 25th Egypt. And I think that most of the interviews
sorry for interrupting you, but what we saw on Tuesday was unprecedented in the modern history of Egypt. Like more than 600 people died, and the toll is expected to rise. That's not what we expected to have to happen after the ouster of Mubarak, did we?
I think that's correct. I mean, one of the things that we had been saying from the very beginning, one of the greatest threats to the Arab Spring is going to be the management of expectations. It's very not normal in terms of the modern history of Egypt, but if you look at democracy and transition and institutional building, unfortunately, it's never an easy path. It's never something that happens in a few years. The expectations of the Egyptian people is that the next step will move to more, again, of a correction or moving into the right direction. Of course, there's definitely many people, particularly supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, who feel that the question of democracy and legitimacy and particularly protection of the ballot box has been what has been sacrificed in the last few days. But even the most pessimistic people from the supporters of Morsi and the Brotherhood will continue to say that the goal is to put Egypt back on the right track, and that majority of people are willing to do all that it takes to get back into moving towards real change in Egypt.
Manal, have you been happy with the U.S. response towards Egypt, and do you think the United States can do more, or as Graham said, its leverage is very limited on Egypt? What do you think?
I think it's, my personal opinion about the U.S. response is almost irrelevant. What's really important is what the Egyptian reaction is. And, a majority of my interviews in Egypt were very frustrated, not only by the U.S. administration, but what was happening in Washington. They felt that the debates about a coup versus a correction was very much out of touch of what Egyptian people were talking about. People are debating about what the next step for Egypt is, while they felt that people in Washington are still debating and trying to catch up with news. The sense has been that the statements from the U.S. government have been inconsistent, and that there's confusion in terms of who actually has authority to be speaking about the next steps in foreign policy. That said, yesterday I spoke with a lot of my Egyptian colleagues, and they felt that Obama's statement was beginning to correct that, and that there was more balance coming out based on what the speech was that Obama gave yesterday morning.
Graham, I'd like to come back to you. Manal talked about the inconsistencies we've seen in the formal speech made by different administration officials, including John Kerry. I think it was a couple of weeks ago when he said what the military did was something like that. I'm paraphrasing what he said was a democratic move, or was to protect democracy in Egypt. Do you think what can the U.S. administration do? What can President Obama do to make sure that the Egyptians will move in the right direction and will establish a democratic country for their people?
Well, I think the issue is the United States is limited, as I said before, and I agree with Manal. The people in Egypt are moving forward. They believe that Egypt will never be the same as it was before January 25th, 2011. However, I think there was a majority of Egyptians who began to believe that the government of President Morsi no longer was legitimate in the eyes of most Egyptians, because it was taking on powers and acting in a way that was not inclusive, and therefore a correction was necessary. That viewpoint has not become the dominant viewpoint in Washington. The viewpoint in Washington is a duly elected president has been removed through a movement which included the military, and therefore it's illegal. So the administration finds itself caught between the popular opinion in Egypt and the perceptions in Washington. I think the administration is doing a fairly reasonable job, as Manal said, of taking the course and trying to be a balancing force. That said, that's not where opinion is in Washington, and therefore because of our divided government, you hear all sorts of voices coming out, and I'm afraid the Egyptians are going to continue to hear a mixed message from Washington because we have many people who feel they're involved in the foreign policy debate.
Some people, including John McCain, have said that what happened in Egypt was a coup d'etat. But President Obama has avoided using the term coup, even though even the newspapers, prominent newspapers such as the New York Times and Washington Post, in their editorials have called the military takeover a coup d'etat and have called on the U.S. administration to cut off aid. Don't you think that would be the right thing for the U.S. to do, for President Obama to do? That would send at least a message to the Egyptians that Americans are sincere about what happened in Egypt.
Well, I think the term coup d'etat has certain legal ramifications in American law, and that's why the administration have not done that. If a country has a democratically elected government and that government is replaced through a coup d'etat, aid must be cut off immediately if that occurs. Therefore, the administration cannot use the word coup d'etat unless it intends to eliminate the U.S. assistance to the Egyptian military. I think the feeling at this moment is that would be burning a relationship that has taken 35 years to develop and would be an error. We need to take a little time, wait, and see how things evolve. But the Egyptians should be under no false pretense that the United States is considering that. Clearly they are, and pressures will amount on the administration to take that action, particularly when Congress returns in a couple weeks.
Manal, when we see the United States being reluctant about calling what happened in Egypt a coup, which was clearly a coup, one could ask the question that the promotion of democracy that the United States has been claiming for decades in the region and in the world does not apply when it comes to Islamists. So if an Islamist wins elections, the United States promotion of democracy stops there. Do you agree with that, or what do you make of what I just said?
I think that it's a very good point, and that's definitely what you're hearing on the ground from people who support the Muslim Brotherhood inside Egypt. I think that it's very important that we also recognize that political Islam doesn't start and end with the Muslim Brotherhood. There's quite a diverse number of political parties. I mean, let's not forget Hizb an-Nur, which is the primarily Salafi party, which has done an alliance with the military. Let's also not forget Al-Azhar institution, which is also sided with the military. So it can't, we can't say that anything that happens with the Muslim Brotherhood automatically equals the death of political Islam. I think we have to be very cautious from jumping to that conclusion, although that is the primary talking point for the Brotherhood at this time. I also think that it's important to really listen to the diverse opinions within Egypt, and I was quite taken aback. Again, I just got back from Egypt on Sunday, and I was surprised at how many people kept telling me the Arab Spring wasn't about democracy, it wasn't about the final outcome of elections, and that they didn't believe in death by elections just because Morsi had won, but it really was about how Egyptians could lead a better life and what the future of Egypt was. And over and over, people, and these are people who also were very much against the military intervention, but were saying that they just didn't believe in Morsi being the one to move forward and take Egypt to the direction it needed to go.
Graham, if we look at the region,
it was more of a
Manal, thank you. Sorry for the interruption. I would like to go to Graham. Graham, if you look at the region, you would after the Arab Spring, after the so-called Arab Spring, I mean, you don't see any tangible, happy outcome in the region. Libya, you see there are militia groups, different militia groups operating in Libya. Syria is in a civil war. You see, Egypt is in a turmoil. Isn't the fair question to ask that the Arab Spring is over, really? What, are you hopeful that we're going to get out of this situation?
Democracy is a very difficult process, and for any of the countries who have democratic governments now, it did not go easily in the first years or even decades. It is a long process that the people in the Middle East have engaged in. Clearly right now, things look in turmoil. I mean, it is very worrisome about the amount of carnage throughout the region, but that's going to happen as people begin the process of developing new institutions, new relationships. It takes a long time. This is going to be a painful process, and those of us on the outside can encourage, can help, but in the end, the people of the Middle East are going to have to make the determination how they want to govern themselves.
Graham, but when we see in Egypt, like the members of the Muslim Brotherhood are in prison, including their democratically elected leader, one could say, and the Muslim Brotherhood won almost 60% of the votes. One could say that there will be no democracy unless the Islamists are also free. They're also allowed to participate in the political process. And if they are not allowed, and if they know the United States is... Go ahead, please. Yeah.
No, I don't think there's any doubt in Egypt that the Muslim Brotherhood is an essential element of the political fabric of Egyptian society. When you speak to people in the interim government, they are absolutely adamant that they want to find a solution that brings the Muslim Brotherhood, as well as all the other parties, into the process of determining how the country should advance, including the next round of elections. I don't think anybody in the interim government believes the exclusion of the Muslim Brotherhood is wise, feasible, and something that they should move toward. The problem has been the Muslim Brotherhood, because of its feels so aggrieved by the events and the removal of President Morsi, has found it unable to cooperate with any of the other parties. Until there can be an agreement on how they can work together, we're going to have this impasse. My personal feeling is that the Muslim Brotherhood actually loses the longer this goes on, because they have a long-standing problem with much of Egyptian society that believe that they are not really loyal enough to Egypt. They're more loyal to transnational Islam. And the longer they were staying in the square and being disruptive, harming the Egyptian economy, keeping the political process at a stalemate, that was reinforcing that negative belief.
But they could radicalize as well. I mean, they could lose support, definitely, but they could radicalize as well if they know, for instance, if the United States is a reason for what's happening in Egypt. If they know the United States, I mean, the United States is still providing assistance to the Egyptian army. Manal, don't you think it's time really for the US to cut off aid to Egypt to stop the carnage?
I think that there's too many implications with a quick decision, and I think that the administration is making a very strategic move and weighing all options. I think that it should still be on the table. It needs to be something that's considered. I think that the messaging of no violence and the use of excessive force will not be tolerated. This is also being said in Egypt. 9 human rights organizations condemned the use of excessive violence. I think your point about extremism is a very good point, and it's a very frightening one. Over the last 2 years, you've taken away one of the primary recruitment slogans for young people to enter into extremist groups. And my fear is that the current situation will create a new slogan. No matter what happens, whether it's Algeria immediately or a longer term in Egypt, that they'll always fight anyone within an Islamic background coming into power. Of course, I don't agree with that narrative, but I think that narrative is gaining traction and could be used to create more extremist groups in the region.
So is Egypt any close to be called a failed state or a rogue state?
I don't think so. I think that it's very far away from being called a failed state. You still have an interim government that overall has maintained security. I think that today, the events of today and moving into the weekend, particularly response to Friday prayer is an important litmus test. I'm talking to people, watching to see what will happen. But I think we're very far away from calling it a failed state. I also think that there is still opportunity to come back to the table. I mean, undoubtedly the last 48 hours have made it very difficult, but I do believe that one thing we've learned from Egypt is never to underestimate the ability for Egyptians to surprise us. And I think that there should be some faith that there will be enough pressure, and of course the pressure will need to come internationally, but for people to come back to the table and find a peaceful resolution to this so that the escalation of violence doesn't continue.
Graham, the crisis in Egypt, or the escalation of the crisis in Egypt, has sort of taken our attention away from Syria, where people die on a daily basis. Do you think that should accordingly take the attention of the world powers away from Syria? Is that good for the United States to ignore the crisis in Syria and shift its attention to Egypt?
No, I don't think the United States should ignore the crisis in Syria, and I don't think the world should ignore the crisis in Syria. Syria is an ongoing problem. The problem for any government is you only have so much energy and so many resources and so much attention. And what happens is when you have a crisis like you see in Cairo, and Egypt is certainly more significant to the region than Syria, attentions naturally go in that direction. Sure. That said, Syria remains the same conundrum it always has been. Here you have a country that is basically dividing itself along sectarian lines, and a civil war is going on, and there is no foreseeable way to get out of that crisis, and that's a problem for everybody. It is sometimes easier to look away because we have no constructive answers to offer.
Graham, you said that Egypt is more important, at least for the United States or for the Western powers. Can you come to the basics and tell us the importance of Egypt to the United States?
I think Egypt is important to the region. Egypt has always been the state that's the fulcrum of political power in the Middle East. How Egypt goes, the majority of the region goes. I like to say historically there have been three major changes since the Second World War in the region. When the revolution occurred in Egypt in the early 1950s and the Egyptian government moved towards the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union, the balance of power shifted in favor of the Soviet Union for the next 15 years, as long as Egypt remained in that camp. When Egypt made the determination in power politics that it was more in its interest to be with the West, it tipped the balance through the work with the United States and the peace treaty with Israel, and the United States has been the dominant force in the region ever since. If Egypt were to make a decision to go in a different direction, that would affect the entire balance of power in the region. In addition, the United States and Egypt have cooperated in a whole range of issues, not only peace between Egypt and Israel, but also in strategic cooperation. It is hard to overestimate the importance of the Suez Canal for American military considerations. We are able, as Americans, to move an entire carrier battle group from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean overnight, almost, within a day. Otherwise, they would have to sail all the way around Africa. That has given our military tremendous flexibility that we otherwise would not have. And we've cooperated in many other fields. Therefore, we will have to look very carefully, the United States, on what the relationship's going to be. We think Egypt should be a state that sets examples for others. That's why we supported the Arab Spring in Egypt. We supported the democratic movement. That's why we're concerned now. That we will encourage the Egyptian government and people to move in the democratic direction, but that we are limited.
Manal, I would like to come back to you and ask you a question about, he mentioned the security of Israel and the importance of Egypt, and you know the Camp David Treaty. I think Graham is one of those who worked on the treaty. Is very important for the United States and Israel as well. Do you think U.S. policy in the Middle East is dictated by this perception of Israel's security in the Middle East? And Israel, do you think that is the case?
I think that it's most definitely a central part of the calculation. Israel remains to be one of the primary allies to the U.S. in the region, and that to say that there isn't calculations of Israeli security when looking at Egypt, I think would be very naive. At the same time, I think it's important, and you alluded to this in your introduction, that if you look at the broader region, there are so many large countries, Syria, even the current situation in Iraq. There's huge escalation of violence. The questions around Iran. To lose a strong ally like Egypt, I don't think would only have implications in terms of Israeli security, but I think would have greater implications in terms of the region as a whole.
We mentioned Iraq. We recently saw a lot of really like some sort of unprecedented attacks in years in Iraq. In one day, more than 60 people died in the south and the center of Iraq. At the same time, these attacks by Al-Qaeda, they claim that Al-Qaeda has admitted, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, that it has carried out those attacks. Come just few weeks or a couple months after President Obama gave a speech at National Defense University and said Al-Qaeda was on the defeat. Do you think that was a speech far from reality, as John McCain said it back then?
think that the situation has completely changed in the region, and I think one of the challenges that the administration has is to now adjust to the changes that are taking place. Taking into the calculation of Syria and its influence on Iraq, it can't be underestimated. I mean, what you were talking about before were corridors between the country. You're now talking about a completely open border between them. In fact, Al-Qaeda has changed its name from AQI, Al-Qaeda Iraq, to Al-Qaeda, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Isham. So even in terms of their territory in the area that they're seeing it very connected, and that has led to a new reality. I wouldn't say that Al-Qaeda is fully back in Iraq, but you see enough triggers to be very concerned, and I think it behooves the international community to look very closely to Iraq, to stand by Iraq, and to make sure that what's going on in the region doesn't overwhelm the situation in Iraq.
Graham, just one more question, if you answer me very quickly, because we will go to a short break. This increasing violence in Iraq seems like a spillover effect of the crisis in Syria. What do you make of that?
I don't think, I've heard that before, but I really think the crisis in Iraq is a spillover effect of what's going on in the region as people increasingly identify with their sectarian community.
Graham, they're telling me that I have to take a break now.
Community.
I'll come back to you for the question. I have to take a short break now, but after this break, we will come back to continue our discussion with our two guests. Stay with us. Hello again and welcome back to Inside America. Now I would like to look at the region in a broader historical context. Muslims are estimated at 1.6 billion people, or 23% of the world population. They are mostly settled in the Middle East. Middle East nations were born shortly after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century. The region as a whole is often regarded as the Arab or Muslim world, but such a holistic vision has proven problematically inaccurate, as the Middle East is home to many other smaller but significant ethnic and religious groups, such as the Kurds, Christians, and Jews. The Muslims are also divided into Shias and Sunnis. Under the Ottoman Empire, however, all of these communities lived side by side in relative peace. The end of the empire was followed by years of colonization by Western powers. The region was soon divided into nation-states. Unlike Europe, nationalism, however, failed to lead to the erosion of pre-modern identities such as tribalism and ethnicity in the Middle East. Ethnic and religious struggles continue to this day. There has never been a genuine democracy in the Middle East. Some blame Islam as a religion that's at odds with democracy. Some blame Western imperial powers for pursuing their selfish interests and supporting autocrats rather than the true aspirations of ordinary Iraqis, Saudis, and Egyptians. Graham, I asked you a question before the break. I said, do you think the violence in Iraq is a spillover effect from Syria? You can now go ahead and continue your answer.
I think it's a reflection of a primary change that has occurred in the region over the last 40 years. When I first went to the Middle East to teach at the American University in Beirut 40-some years ago, if you ask the average person in the Middle East, who are you? The response was, I'm an Arab. That was a common identity that was holding people together. The one exception was, of course, Egypt, who said, I'm an Egyptian. Over the last 40 years, that answer has changed. So today, if you ask somebody, who are you? The common response is, I'm a Muslim. That has major implications for what happens to the other communities that you were mentioning. If the primary identity is religion, Islam, it then becomes what happens to the Christians? What happens to the divisions within Islam? And I think as you've seen the split occur in recent years between Shia and Sunni, that is a very worrying trend throughout the region. And I think Iraq is suffering because of people changing their identity from being Iraqis and Arabs to being Sunnis and Shia. That is a problem that the whole region faces. That's what Syria is facing. I'd like to make a note, though, Egypt is a little different. In Egypt, they say we're Egyptians, and that is what holds people together. And therefore, the story in Egypt is likely to be very different from that in the Levant.
Graham, but as you said, the identity seems to have changed from people defining themselves as nationalists, as Egyptians, to more as Muslims. But as we see also democracy failing to take root in Egypt, That makes us to think of like people like Huntington, who said Islam and democracy are incompatible. Is that true?
I don't believe that at all. I think it depends how you define democracy. I think if you define democracy as people having the right to choose their own government and have their own representation, I think that can happen in the Middle East. It can happen in Islamic countries. For a long time, they said this could not happen in Catholic countries. It could only happen in Protestant countries. It's an evolution of mankind that people want to govern themselves. And it's a fundamental principle that we Americans live by, and we believe that Muslims and everyone else can do that too. Is it easy getting there? No. Are there likely to be serious problems for many years? Absolutely. But can the people in the Middle East and the Islamic world get there? I have complete faith they can do that if they want to.
So you believe Islam is as democratic, as pro-democracy as Christianity?
Absolutely. I mean, at the time of the Prophet, the Islamic society was much more representative and free and open than was European society. It's just things change over time. There's an evolution. People's line of thinking things. We all change, and we change over generations. And there's no reason why the people of the Middle East are any different than other people who strive for that basic desire to govern themselves and have a government that represents the will of the people.
Manal, I would like to come to you and give me a more cultural perspective. You've lived in the Middle East. You know the people. And do you think if we can't blame Islam as a religion for the lack of democracy in our countries, can we blame the culture?
I think I'll give you two answers. One is, someone who's originally from the region and what I hear from the region, and then the other one is kind of from a conflict-sensitive lens of looking at it, analyzing the conflict. But first, I think that, what's important in the region is perception is reality, and people very strongly believe that, that there needs to be a benevolent dictator, that there's the strong man myth, and, that's been rooted in 30, 40 years of different types of dictatorships across the region. So, I think that what we're seeing is a lot of people who have been indoctrined with this mentality of the only way to keep the different minorities together, the only way to keep the different ethnicities together is this strong man coming in. Hopefully he'll be benevolent in the form of what we've seen through the monarchies, or hopefully avoid the brutality that we've seen in Libya and Iraq, but still believing in that strong myth. So I wouldn't tie it to culture, I wouldn't tie it to religion, only because we've seen in the longer history of both the Arab culture and the Islamic religion, and as well as the wealth of diversity within the ethnic and religious minorities in the region, that there is opportunities there. I do think it's tied to the last 40, 50 years of dictatorship, and that is what I would say is the primary challenge of changing the mentalities. I remember when I was in Baghdad.
Manal, sorry for interrupting you.
I remember in Baghdad many people telling me
and that you blame the dictatorships we've had for the past few decades as the key reason, as the major reason for the lack of democracy in the Middle East. But those dictators were supported by the West, many of them at least. Does that mean that you have to blame the Western imperialist powers in turn for what we are experiencing currently in the region?
I think that there's definitely a lot of responsibility to be shared with that. I think that a lot of people from the region would argue that a lot of these dictatorships would have not been sustained if it wasn't for Western support. I do think that one of the beauties of the Arab Spring was the temptation, particularly from the younger generation, to say, let's move away from the blame game and looking for responsibility, and let's talk more about accountability. And I think that's one of the questions facing all countries, facing Iraq today, is what's the level of accountability? But again, will be the primary challenge facing the military in Egypt, is that eventually the people will come back and say that you also have to be accountable to us on the use of excessive force and on the roadmap that you've promised.
Graham, I'd like to come back to you and ask you a question about oil. Nothing has happened in the oil-producing nations of the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia. I mean, something happened in Bahrain, but it was crushed very soon. What do you make of the role of oil in all of this, in democracy promotion in the Middle East? And can you give me your insight on that?
Well, clearly oil is important because if a government has more resources, they can better take care of their population and there's less discontent. When people are poor and there's no jobs, that creates a higher level of discontent. At the same time, the societies are very different in the Gulf states. I mean, I remember I used to joke with the people in the United Arab Emirates when Sheikh Zayed was there, and they were all pleased with their government because they felt Sheikh Zayed listened to them. And I was thinking that we in the United States at the same time, we were democratic, but most Americans didn't feel their government was listening to them. So the government has to be responsive, and if the governments in the Gulf states stay responsive to their people and meet their needs, there'll be less of a demand for change. But on the other hand, people will want some change. They will want more representation in all of those states too. Each state will have to address the problems of the people of their own state. Each one will be different, but they're clearly moving in the direction that the people want, as Manal says, more accountability, and they want a government that actually listens to them and reflects their views.
Graham, after the Arab Spring, we saw the United States shifting its foreign policy more towards the people because the people became more powerful and toppled their longtime dictators in parts of the Arab world. But that wasn't the same everywhere. Like in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, in parts of the Arab world, the United States stayed as allies of the regimes. Don't you think it's really time for the United States to take sides with the people rather than with the regimes?
Well, that's a very difficult question, because if you're in government and you work with part of the government, governments have relationship with governments. They don't have relationships with people. You try to develop programs and activities that tie you to the people, but in the end, governments have no choice but to work with governments.
Manal, what do you make of that? Do you think the United States, the same question, the United States has to change its foreign policy in the Middle East?
I think that there has to be a lot better consistency. It's something that people are asking for. Having a faith in the United States. The United States is stepping forward in the peace negotiations. They can potentially play a very important role internally in Egypt, given time and giving requests from the different parties. And if they're the perceived double standards, which are very strong from the regional perspective, and remember, perception is reality in a lot of the region, then the United States could lose traction in the countries where they've once been strong. So I think the consistency and really targeting this perception of the United States has double standards, as you said, in terms of Arab Spring countries, but also, even before, I think is going to be one of the big challenges for foreign policy.
Manal Umar with the United States Institute for Peace, thank you so much for talking to Rudao. Green Bannerman, a Middle East Institute scholar, thank you so much for talking to us as well. Dear viewers, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, be well.